Most of the time when we look at old games companies, we're entirely talking about them in the past tense, because they aren't around anymore and haven't been for years. Really, the only time that wasn't the case perhaps was when we looked at Team 17. However, today we have another company to add to that list, a company that can actually trace their origins all the way back to the very beginning of the UK microcomputer boom in the early 1980s, and are still going strong today. They're still here, and they're still independent almost 40 years later. They are, of course, System-3, an independent publisher that, through a fair share of ups and downs, a bit of bravado and, of course, some classic games along the way, have tried to maintain a pretty high standard of quality. That's always been the case since 1982, and today, they still do that. So, it's time to have a look at one of the British scene's great survivors. This is the story, and the games, of the almighty System-3. It's quite a lengthy history, and so we're going to have to do it in two parts. In this first part we'll cover the 1980s and their glittering portfolio on the 8-bit machines, particularly the Commodore 64. The name of System-3 is generally wrapped up with one man and one man alone, a Londoner by the name of Mark Cale. Throughout the company's history they've generally existed as a publisher, hiring people on a freelance basis. And while a lot of brilliant talent has certainly passed through the company over the years, only a few names such as Tim Best, Hugh Riley and John Twiddy have taken up significantly long residencies, on and off, leaving Mark as the company's only constant over its 35+ year existence. How did he get started? Well, he kind of got started through being a bit of an annoying whinger. Let me explain. As a youngster, one of Mark's passions was, and indeed still remains, photography. After school he started working for the famous Norman Parkinson and learnt plenty more about his passion, something that he's kept going ever since. But in his words for Retro Gamer when interviewed by David Crooks, at the time he kind of figured that there wasn't going to be a whole lot of money in a career doing photography. And so he started thinking about other things that he could do, which in a roundabout way led to something else he rather enjoyed. Games. He had a regular gig at the time taking photos for Atari UK, and while he was there he tended to moan a lot about the quality of the games being released for the VCS, saying that they weren't good enough. We don't know whether it was out of encouragement or, more likely, out of sheer annoyance, but a man by the name of John Norledge, Atari UK's development manager, said to Mark that if he wanted games that met with his seal of approval, he should go and set up his own publishing house. A light bulb went off in his head, and with the help of two friends, Emerson Best and Michael Koo, the 18-year-old Mark set up System-3 out of his bedroom in 1982. The name was born out of the course they were on, which was called System Studies, and there being 3 of them. System-3 very quickly became System-2, as Michael left to concentrate on his studies, leaving Mark and Emerson to put out the company's first games, Colony 7 for the Atari 8-bits, Laser Cycle for the BBC Micro, and Death Star Interceptor for the Commodore 64 and ZX Spectrum. None of these titles are particularly well known these days, but they did the job, making the fledgling publisher enough money so that they could keep going towards the next title. Of the 3 titles there's no doubt which one was the most important. System-3 never ended up doing too much on the Atari 8-bits or the BBC Micro, but Death Star Interceptor was the first title released on the computer that they would make their name on. There's no real doubt about it. When you think of System-3, you think of games made for the C64. This game was the beginning of a beautiful relationship. The game itself, as you might have guessed from the name, is very much inspired by a certain story that's set in a galaxy far, far away. It's a space shooter with 3 different scenes, one that takes place outside of the Death Star, a quickie taking off scene at the beginning, and another that naturally takes place in the Death Star's trench, with the aim naturally being to get to the end, hit that exhaust port, and blow the whole thing up in as spectacular a style as these old systems can manage. The Specky version, which is commonly regarded as the best version, is even more blatant about its inspiration. Your ship actually fights both TIE fighters and X-Wings, which suggests a dark scenario where the Rebels and the Empire have actually gotten together. And when you blow the Death Star up, guess what music you hear? As I've often said, this was a time, 1984, when such blatant rip-offs were likely to fly under the radar and not result in lawsuits. However, things were changed a little on the Commodore. Here the blatant takes from Star Wars have been replaced by, well, generic chemical compound ships. I imagine that the reason for this was that, being a Commodore 64 game, and not exactly a bad selling one, Mark Cale wanted to try and sell the game in the C64's country of origin, the USA. And so, even if the C64 version of this game may well have had TIE fighters and the like at one point, they ended up being removed. Mark's trip to the USA ended up being a very productive one where he met with several big US names, chiefly Epix and Electronic Arts, with the views to setting up a working relationship. Talks with these two companies fell through, but System-3 did manage to find an inroad with Activision, who were looking to establish themselves in the UK software market. Mark met up with Activision at the perfect time. They'd just entered into partnership with Electric Dreams Software to release Activision games in the UK. And so, System-3 set up a partnership of their own to get their games in the US for Activision, with Rod Cousins of Electric Dreams acting as a sort of intermediary. Mark also came back with a couple of goodies from talks with the US publisher Tronix. He brought back a couple of their Commodore 64 games, Suicide Strike, Deuce and Motocross, and he did a deal to market and sell them in the UK. Taking games from foreign lands and distributing them wouldn't be a path that System-3 would go back down again for quite a while, but they were amongst the first to do it in Europe, if not the first full stop, possibly beating US Gold, who obviously became a lot more famous for doing it, to the punch by a couple of months or so. Having gotten into the computer business by way of a beleaguered employee's sharp retort to a young and mouthy photographer, System-3 had made a pretty okay start to their business. You might say that in getting in to have meetings with the likes of EA and Activision, despite only having a handful of pretty small titles on the shelves, they'd been punching well above their weight. However, they did need a bit more, something to take them to the next level if the story was going to go beyond a few not bad games published out of a bedroom. Fast talk and good timing had got them in with Activision, and there was certainly a commitment to making quality software. As their mission statement said, perfection was the only acceptable standard. But such words naturally need to be backed up with classics. It was around this time that System-2 became System-1. Mark Cale's friend Emerson Best leaves the picture, leaving Mark to run the company alone. However, Emerson did provide the inspiration before he left for the company's first really, and I do mean really, big hit. When he wasn't co-running System-3 with Mark, Emerson's main passion was as a keen practitioner of Taekwondo. In fact, he was quite good at it. He'd competed for the national British team. This love of martial arts, naturally, led to the inspiration for a fighting game which Emerson and Mark agreed to call International Karate. And then, as mentioned, Emerson left soon after. Mark looked for a developer to create this game, and found one in Basildon by the name of LT Software. Now, is that name familiar to you? It may well be if you watched the earlier documentary that I made on Sensible Software. LT were a short-lived and, in the grand scheme of things, quite minor developer, credited on few games but crucial in the development of a couple of younger folk who were associated with them, particularly the two men who'd go on to create Sensible Software, John Hare and Chris Yates. And someone else too, who we'll mention shortly. Anyway, System-3 chose to work with LT, commissioning International Karate, and also eventually taken up the first Sensible Software game, which was then called Mother of Harlots. The decision was, well, it really wasn't a good one. LT were quite the chaotic company, as it turned out, and the person who later signed the job of creating International Karate 2? Well, he was apparently kind of eccentric. Perhaps a bit too fond of various herbal and chemical remedies, so we'll say. His identity pretty much remains unknown, and one day, well, the guy just left. He upped sticks, walked out of the office one day and buggered off, never to be seen again, leaving LT with a thoroughly unfinished game, albeit one with some okay enough artwork provided by John Hare, and a deadline that naturally had to be met. Enter a young man who'd just finished up on his first game, a kind of Defender-esque but very playable indeed shooter for a couple of micros by the name of Drop Zone. Enter Archer McLean. With Archer McLean on board, International Karate as a project starts to get back on track. However, there is plenty of pressure. We're in the third quarter of 1985 now, the name of International Karate is starting to get bandied around in magazines, and we are heading towards one of the biggest dates in the British computing calendar, the annual PCW show. This show, run by Personal Computer World, which was then the oldest and indeed first British computing magazine, was the biggest of the year, with companies the world over come into play. Big enough to be reported on by the computer-based TV shows like, say, Database. Big enough for all the big cheeses to come and play, the likes of Alan Sugar with the latest weapons from Amstrad's assault on the market, and Jack Tramiel, there to promote the all-new Atari ST. System-3 were also there with a stand and, well, they didn't have a whole lot to show. Mother of Harlots was on display, but International Karate, the major title, was still in the shed. And yet if System-3 were to survive, they needed to make an impact right here, right now. And so, they went all in anyway. Hell, Mark even persuaded his mother to remortgage the house. It was PCW or bust. How did they do it? Well, they chose to disrupt. Young and bolshy, they went all out on their stand with scantily clad dancers and karate exhibitions. Lots of blocks of wood were put to the sword, or rather the karate chop, with the aim of promoting international karate, and lots of thoroughly made up dancers were going about their thing with plenty of play violence and whips in the service of Mother of Harlots. The slogan was, naughty, but nice. Mark was pretty sure that such a display would piss off the quite conservative and Christian-minded organisers of the PCW show, and indeed it did. The System-3 stand was under siege with organisers threatening to turn the power off to System-3 stand if this beastly unpleasantness continued. Mark held out for as long as possible, insisting that it was only entertainment for the kids, before finally agreeing to remove the dancing girls, although the karate exhibitions remained. The girls might have been a bit relieved about it. They were working barefoot, and all the splinters on the floor from endless blocks of wood getting chopped in half wasn't exactly making for prime working conditions. Needless to say, System-3 were not exactly welcomed back to the PCW show in the future. They pretty much became the first company to be banned from the expo. But it didn't really matter to them, because they had gotten what they'd wanted. They'd held out long enough to ensure that their raunchy exhibition had been snapped plenty of times by the photographers from Fleet Street, which guaranteed them tons of attention. Not just from tabloids, but from computer game mags like Crash, whose own reports from the expo were chock full of pictures from System-3's display. They were loud, proud, and most definitely controversial, but they'd got people's attention. Still, it would all have been nothing more than a flash in the pan if the games that System-3 were promoting didn't deliver. Mother of Harlots, eventually rechristened Twister Mother of Charlotte, is a pretty good game, a fine title with multiple scenes and rather cool graphics, but in the end it wasn't a big seller, and a proposed C64 version of the title was cancelled. John Hare and Chris Yates had no trouble working with System-3, but somewhat annoyed at the lack of money they received from LT, who took the line's portion of System-3's commission, they went off to do their own thing, and the rest is history. However, it would be International Karate, the game with the absolutely disastrous development cycle, that would become System-3's first massive hit, and stone cold classic. Archer McLean took what was there and rebuilt it into a masterpiece. Well, on the C64 at least, let's just not talk about the ZX Spectrum version. International Karate on the Commodore 64 is a pretty good contender for being one of the best, if not the best fighting game released in those heady days before the onset of games like Street Fighter II. It's quite a simple game. One button and or a direction controls your movement and your attack. Knockdowns score either a half point or a full point depending on the cleanliness of the strike, and 2 points win the fight. There's bonus games on offer, including naturally a spot of head-on wood violence, and you keep fighting others in order to get more belts until, if you're really good, you finally obtain the black belt and become a master. The whole thing just continues until, eventually, you lose. Playing International Karate is just relaxing. So efficient and so much fun, it's more than held up today. The top-notch music provided by the almighty Rob Hubbard only seals the deal even further. It's one of the Commodore's best games. As a fighting game from this era, there are few games that can match or beat it. One of them is, of course, the sequel, which we'll get to eventually. Another one, perhaps, is the Melbourne house game Way of the Exploding Fist, which had come out a few months earlier, a game that International Karate is very similar to, and one that Archer McLean, interviewed for Retro Gamer, acknowledges as an inspiration. He played Exploding Fist to death. International Karate is like another take on Exploding Fist, certainly visually, although there are differences in how they play, with Fist being a bit slower. Still, they're similar to the point where you might wonder if Melbourne House ever complained about it legally. But, as far as I can tell, no, they didn't. Indeed, both games seem to mutually benefit each other, with later Fist games and upgrades taking cues from International Karate and its sequels. As we'll see soon though, another company didn't quite see it the same way. With International Karate, System-3 were able to back up their loud and controversial PCW show display by releasing a smash of a game. A big, critically adored hit. Mind you, there were some who didn't much like it. Chiefly, Activision. The PCW show controversy hadn't spoiled System-3's relationship with the Americans, who agreed to publish Twister in the US, but they didn't care for International Karate. No less a figure than Scott Orr, founder of the sports label GameStar and the man who would eventually be the lead designer for the John Madden football series, absolutely rubbished the game, calling it typical European trash and saying that it would never work in America. Unfazed, Mark Cale promptly sold International Karate to Epix, who redubbed the game World Karate Championship and sold it to the States, where it went straight to the top of the charts. Activision had got it wrong, and their failure to recognise the hit potential of International Karate convinced them that this young British upstart with all the fast talk actually knew what he was doing. However, this was not quite the end of the original International Karate story. The release of World Karate Championship garnered the attention of Data East USA, and the American win of the Japanese company promptly sued Epix over similarities to their 1984 arcade game Karate Champ. In their eyes, Epix had infringed on their copyright. The case would roll on for a couple of years. The initial outcome from a district court in 1987 was that Epix had infringed on copyright due to the visual similarities between both games, with the result being that all unsold copies of the game had to be recalled. However, Epix appealed the decision, and ultimately, in November 1988, an appeals court decided that International Karate had not infringed on Data East's copyright. There were no substantial similarities. While there were similarities between the two games, these were similarities that encompassed the idea of karate and would therefore be present in all karate video games. In simpler terms, Data East could not copyright the idea of a karate game. This judgment actually turned out to be quite important, as it was one of the first of its kind. Ironically enough, the result of this exact judgment would help out Data East years later, when Capcom sued them for breach of copyright over the game Fighter's history and its similarity to Street Fighter II. Capcom lost the case because, again, they could not hold copyright over the idea of a fighting game and the various expressions of those ideas that would naturally be similar over basically all fighting games. We've gotten a little off of the subject of System-3, but it's fun to note how important this title was in many areas, even outside of the world of gaming. That Data East vs Epix judgment has been used a lot in the ensuing years. A suit that Microsoft launched against Apple over the similarities between their respective OS's GUIs was defeated, with the Data East Epix case being used as a major citation. Isn't legal history fun? Anyway, as far as the main story goes, System-3 had their first really big hit of a game. They would remain in the world of martial arts for their next one, which wasn't too far away. In 1987 they used martial arts in a wholly different way, not just to have two people beating each other up in the name of competition, but to tell something that was more of a story. In other words, they made an action-adventure, and the finished product would turn out to be a platform-defining title for the Commodore 64. The original idea for what would eventually become The Last Ninja was Mark Cale's, and he had it in 1985, although his desire to create an action-adventure game went back even further than that. In fact, pretty much back to the very first action-adventure game, Adventure on the Atari 2600. However, it was 1985 when the proper idea would be formulated. An isometric adventure game on the C64, starring a ninja, and filled with action and puzzles. As was the case with most System-3 games, the title would have to try and push boundaries, and being an isometric game with high-res graphics, The Last Ninja was certainly going to be doing that. In a time when most games were done and dusted in a couple of months or so of development, the development of The Last Ninja, from original idea to eventual release, took 2 whole years. How did the game take so long? Well, there were various reasons. Initially, the idea of the game caused quite a bit of tension in the halls of System-3 itself, with a fair few of the company's programmers believing that the game simply couldn't be done and thus leaving as a result. Mark Cale was pretty damn obstinate when it came to pushing this title through. Still, people would remain who would play an important part in the development of the game, and indeed the series as a whole, such as the eventual producer and designer, the late Tim Best. Despite that, several development teams were broken on the back of The Last Ninja. They were working with concept art and graphics that were supplied by Bob Stevenson and Hugh Riley respectively, but they were unable to get to grips with what Mark Cale wanted. It was a tall order. The most famous of these attempts came from a Hungarian company called Softview, which was basically a subsidiary of Robert Stein's Andromeda, a name you may know either from the big hit Caesar the Cat, or more likely from their supporting role in the famous battle for the rights to Tetris. Stein and Andromeda worked sort of as intermediaries between the West and the programmers that were working behind the Iron Curtain, and their star was pretty bright around this time. However, after a year's worth of work, Softview had still not been able to wrestle The Last Ninja into a workable game, and their involvement in the project ended. The story behind the Hungarians' attempt at the game has changed a bit over the years. One story that spread earlier on was that Softview's attempt at The Last Ninja was, in fact, nearly done before System-3 took it back, kicked them off the project, and then added the finishing touches before releasing it. Sneaky, if true, but the story has since been proven to be false. The actual story, simply, was that the Hungarian team lacked the technical know-how to pull the game off. They were apparently working in the 4th programming language, which was hardly fit for purpose. It made everything really slow. Mark and Hugh Riley took 3 trips to Budapest over the course of the Hungarian team's time with the game, and they found it to be far from finished. Most of Hugh's sprites weren't even animated, let alone fighting with each other. Eventually they took the program back, with Robert Stein duly refunding all advances that System-3 had paid to them. The Hungarian development wasn't totally fruitless. One member of the team, Istvan Bodnari, created a level editor called Integrator that would eventually prove crucial to the game's creation. But the key piece of Last Ninja's puzzle was finally put in place when Mark contacted a hotshot young coder by the name of John Twiddy to take what had already been done, rewrite the code, get the levels created, sprites animated, and finally bring this title to life. He refined the Integrator editor to use half the memory, he innovated when it came to getting the C64 to display as many high-res objects as it did with the game, and he successfully worked around various limitations. The process took about 2 to 3 months, and it was as intense as all hell. John Twiddy worked pretty much all the hours in the day on The Last Ninja, mostly at Mark Cale's apartment with the man himself watching over his shoulders. This was a brutal death march of a push to finally bring the game to fruition, and by John Twiddy's estimation there was probably 1 single byte of memory left over by the time the game was actually finished. People have often bemoaned the fact that The Last Ninja, after providing such an epic adventure for the time, finishes with a lousy single screen, mostly text-based ending. And that was the reason. There simply wasn't enough room for anything else. Finally then, the game was done and dusted. Soon enough, it was out. And was it all worth it? Yes. Yes, it was. The Last Ninja was a massive, platform-defining hit. It sold millions of copies. One of the Commodore 64's crown jewels, this was a game that C64 owners truly could lord over everyone else, as you could only really play it here. The C64's major European competitors, the Amstrad CPC and ZX Spectrum, didn't get any kind of port of the game, with other ports mostly reserved for higher end machines like the Amiga and Atari ST. Not that ports for the likes of the Speccy weren't worked on, indeed a Speccy version was advertised, but the game was so big and so tough to port over that the effort to release it on the Speccy, as well as other platforms, ultimately just ran aground. Over all versions, the original Last Ninja is believed to have sold a stunning 4 million copies, with its Commodore 64 sales being enough to make it the most successful original game ever released onto the machine. Just what do you do in the game then? Well, you control the ninja Armakuni. He's the last one because the shogun Kotakuni killed all the others in his clan, and now he's out for revenge. He will battle enemies and solve puzzles in 6 levels of action and adventure set in feudal Japan. At first he starts out with only his fists and feet to take enemies on with, but soon Armakuni will have plenty of weapons at his disposal, everything from swords and nunchuckers to throwing stars and smoke bombs. As mentioned, there's also a lot of puzzling to be had, with items to be found and the like, and there's also plenty of precision. You're certainly going to have to do a lot of ninja type things to beat the game. The presentation of The Last Ninja was, and indeed remains, utterly amazing. It's still one of the best looking titles ever to be released on an 8-bit machine. The art is beautiful, and so is the music, courtesy of the excellent and, alas, both sadly departed team of Anthony Lees and Ben Daglish. How fun the game is to actually play these days for people can depend on a few things, I suppose. There are certain parts of The Last Ninja some might find a bit weird, like how Armakuni is a very respectful ninja who, despite all that surrounds him, will only ever walk on paths so as not to anger any samurai parkies who might be lurking around. This may be a bit odd for an adventure, but it was a limitation of the engine. Armakuni has to walk on the paths, otherwise the game wouldn't have been made. There simply wasn't enough memory for him to be able to walk on the grass. That's one of the game's weird quirks. Something that people may find more annoying is the incredibly precise to the point of pixel perfection jumping that Armakuni often has to do. This was John Twiddy's idea, as he felt that the game as designed was a bit too simple in parts. So you get these sections where Armakuni has to jump on stones or branches in various rivers and swamps that, if you get one even slightly, kill you outright. Mark Cale didn't necessarily agree with this, and the pair did have a few rows over the inclusion of these vicious swamps, but ultimately they went in, much to the distress of gamers everywhere. These are the only real frickin' annoying parts about the game. They're far too harsh and represent some of the toughest platforming challenges you will find in any game, but especially here when they're in a game that's not exactly suited to such things. These days you almost have to play the damned thing with a trainer, or perhaps even with save states on an emulator, just because of these parts. Lord knows how he had the patience for things like this back in the day, seriously. That aside, yeah, this game is still pretty good. A lot of this is down to how bloody wonderful it is to look at, especially for fans of the old 8-bit style. There's 6 levels, all of which are appreciably different, but it's still fun to get into some scraps and generally go around and be a ninja. Yes, it can be more than a little too precise in parts, and there may well be a lot of things about the game that would thwart someone trying to get into it now without having played it back in the day, but you can certainly see why this game was so loved by everyone, from magazines to gamers. It was the AAA blockbuster of its day, really, a game that drove the platform to its very outer limits. After such a brutal development cycle, System-3 were justifiably well rewarded by the game's success. They more than achieved what they initially set out to do. Following the success of the original, it would be up to the game's sequels to continue pushing things forward, while perhaps also refining the formula a little. And certainly in the case of The Last Ninja 2, Back with a Vengeance, System-3 did that while taking the story into some quite surprising directions. Thanks to Kotakuni creating a portal and shoving not just himself and his army, but also Armakuni through it, the setting has completely changed. We aren't in feudal Japan anymore, we're now in present-day New York. Naturally, this means there's now plenty more that can thwart our hero, such as cops who can gun him down with a single bullet, the various thugs that roam the street, and, of course, cars on the road. Armakuni's going to have to learn about the Green Cross Code pretty quickly if he's to stand any chance of sending the evil Shogun back to where he came from. The Last Ninja 2 is a pretty bloody good sequel indeed. The gameplay and the engine are much the same, but the gameplay has definitely been tightened up, with considerably less in the way of annoying pixel-perfect jumping sequences and the like, and more of having fun beating up enemies and taking on new challenges that reflect the fish-out-of-water modern world Armakuni finds himself in. And the music? Well, that's just even better this time around. Matt Gray did the soundtrack, and it might just be one of the very best on the C64 full stop, which is a pretty major thing to say. If someone hadn't played any of these games before, I would definitely tell them to start here. The Last Ninja 2 is definitely the most playable of the trio. It can still be kind of frustrating in parts, but the things that are frustrating are kind of par for the course with British microcomputer games of the time, in all honesty. And once again it was another big old hit. Millions more copies sold here, and lots more love. It wasn't entirely without controversy, mind you. While there wasn't ever much of a hubbub around the game including ninjas, despite that word getting censored a fair bit here in the UK, System-3 saw fit to make a special edition of The Last Ninja 2 that not only featured the game, but also featured a ninja handbook, a ninja mask, and a rubber throwing star. That did cause a bit of a hullabaloo, so much so that Boots, a popular store for buying games along with your cosmetics and pills, took the game completely off of their shelves. This is one of those amusing things that naturally you would never get away with today. Sure, this Ninja Death Star may be made out of rubber, but it's still probably going to cause considerable damage to someone's eye, Butters style, if chucked around willy-nilly by impressionable children. This was also the first time a lot of other platforms really got a good taste of the series, such as the ZX Spectrum, which got a perfectly respectable port of the game coded by the ever-excellent Mev Dink. Weirdly, this game also ended up on the NES too, where it was simply known as The Last Ninja. This version isn't exactly bad or anything, although I don't think that NES fans particularly received it that well. Aside from the Wii Virtual Console versions of the Last Ninja games that came years later, this is the only port of a game in the series to a console. Finally, there was The Last Ninja 3, Real Hatred is Timeless, which as far as 8-bits go came out on the C64 only in 1991, with Amiga and Atari ST 16-bit versions following. We've had past settings, we've had present, so naturally this game ends up taking us to the future, as the battle between Armakuni and Kotakuni comes to an end beyond the stars. The game features a bit of a change in personnel. John Twiddy had by this point moved on from System-3, choosing to form a company of his own called Vivid Image with the aforementioned Mev Dink. Mind you, this is far from the end for John and System-3. He's frequently returned several times over the years, and seeing as Vivid were pretty close to System-3's officers, he'd still be somewhat around for this game's development. That said, his replacement was quality. Stan Shembri, previously a coder on the likes of Barbarian and Cauldron 2 for Palace Software, took the reins and chose to strike out on his own with a new engine as opposed to simply using what John Twiddy and Hugh Riley had already created. Said engine already had a run out the previous year on Shembri's first game for System-3, the rather intriguing Vendetta, which we'll get to later on. The end result may well be the least known and probably least treasured game in the series, but there's no doubt that, at least from a presentation standpoint, the game looks absolutely phenomenal, one of the most staggering works on the C64. The graphics have got even more of an upgrade, the soundtrack is phenomenal and very atmospheric, and the game even has a cinematic intro, something you almost never got on the Commodore. As for the gameplay, well, it's more of The Last Ninja, really. If you like those games, you'll like this. And if you don't like them, then this game isn't likely to change your mind about anything, because you already know the deal. Still, this was 1991, and the best thing that can be said about The Last Ninja 3 is that more than anything, it's a fond farewell from System-3 to the platform where they made their name. One last banger on the C64 before fully moving on to the 16-bit platforms. That's pretty much what The Last Ninja 3 is, in the end, and those who are still sticking with the system in the early 90s were pretty damn grateful for it. So there is the condensed story of what is System-3's signature series. They certainly had plenty of popular titles, but there is no doubt that The Last Ninja stands out from the rest of the pack as a phenomenal success in every regard. A title that absolutely put them amongst the premier players at the time. With The Last Ninja, System-3 completely showed that they were more than just brash talkers with a penchant for controversy, but that they absolutely could create highly ambitious and incredibly well-loved games indeed. We aren't quite done with The Last Ninja yet. There will be more to talk about as we have a look at the various failed attempts at bringing Armakuni back for another round. But for now, before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's take a look at some of System 3's other major titles from the 8-bit era. So just to finish off this first part of our look at the almighty System 3, we're going to try and round off their other 8-bit titles, which in the end should take us to about 1991. It's not like we're finished with big names either. There's some pretty major titles to have a look at in this lot too, which shows just how serious these guys were, especially on their much favoured Commodore 64. There were some other important behind-the-scenes things going on around this time too, in particular the end of System 3's relationship with the ailing Activision, but we're going to save that until the second part, so that we can focus on it a bit more. For now, let's take a look at some, for the most part, pretty damn fine games. First up, we've got Bangkok Nights from 1987. It's another beat-em-up. Not one that's as famous as International Karate, of course, but it's certainly one that's got a few fans. It's sort of a kickboxing game, inspired by a trip out to Thailand, and it is one that's quite well loved amongst C64 people. How so? Well, it's mainly about the looks. Bangkok Nights was one of the first fighting games to really feature sprites that were this big and this well defined. There weren't a lot of other games doing stuff like this, especially on computers like the Commodore. There's some very clever multiplexing of sprites going on under the hood to make the game look this smooth, and Hugh Riley and Nick Pellin deserve lots of credit for that. As a game, well, perhaps the actual fighting doesn't hold up quite as well nowadays, especially when compared to something like International Karate. You kinda just get right in there and bash the buttons. But you kind of have to get into the 1987 mindset with this one, and understand that at the time there weren't all that many games like Bangkok Nights around, and back then this was pretty freaking cutting edge. A very memorable game for some people, this one. Dominator from 1989 perhaps isn't quite as memorable. This is more of a regular space shooter, albeit one that has sections that are both vertical and horizontal. For the most part, it's a horizontal affair, kind of in a similar vein to Gradius or Salamander, particularly in the way it goes about giving you power-ups. It's not a bad shooter, although it has some quite familiar foibles that you often find in European shoot-em-ups, such as having a really freaking big and slow ship with enemies that come at you fast and usually take multiple hits to kill. This game is pretty hard as a result. It's not a bad attempt at a shoot-em-up from System 3, and it is one of the only ones, but it kind of lacks refinement, and as a result of that, Dominator isn't usually mentioned amongst the C64's top shooters like, say, Armalite or Delta or Sanction. Okay, this next one is a pretty big deal. Not quite on the Last Ninja level, but not that far off. In 1989, System 3 released Myth: History in the Making, which proved to be one of the most loved and best received titles in the whole of System 3's catalogue. And for once, that love wasn't just limited to the C64. Myth, an action-adventure game where you take a thoroughly modern and seemingly quite normal boy back through time and pit him against many a familiar fantasy, was naturally originally built for the C64 with ports to come later, headed by Pete Barron and, as was usually the case, pushing the Commodore 64 pretty damn hard. The game was very much designed with the C64 in mind and pushed all of the platform's advantages to the fullest. But on the Spectrum, the team of Neil Dodwell and Dave Dew, previously responsible for visually impressive Specky titles like Rex and Nemesis the Warlock, chose to, instead of directly porting Myth from the C64 version, almost create their own interpretation of the title that would be better suited to the Specky. The end result is a title that's equally loved on both systems. In fact, the Spectrum version is often seen as the better of the two, even by Mark Cale himself. This was basically never the case for any other System 3 title in the 8-bit era. In both cases, you control a nameless teenage boy as he travels into the time of legends, various zones set in mythical settings such as Hades, ancient Greece, an Egyptian pyramid and the like. Ultimately, he must defeat Damuan, the Dark Angel of Time, in one-on-one combat if he is to return home. Myth's levels consist of a whole load of enemies to take on, but there's also quite a lot of puzzling to be had too. Often quite obtuse puzzling in fact, way more so than The Last Ninja. But there's a lot of platforming to be had as well. In many ways, Myth can be considered a proto-cinematic platformer. The C64 and Spectrum versions tend to play quite differently. The C64 naturally has scrolling, and you tend to do a lot more hand-to-hand fighting, whereas the Speccy version is a flick screen game and you tend to do a lot more shooting. The C64 version is certainly very impressive indeed, in a way that absolutely meets high expectations, but on the Spectrum? My word. Myth is nothing short of a marvel. One of the most memorable of all the 128K games, the graphics are utterly outstanding. I'm not sure if I can think of too many better examples of sprite work on the system. There's so many huge, glorious examples, so much fluid movement. It is a special, special work. The final battle against Dameron, even if it is a strange shooter section that doesn't necessarily fit in with the rest of the game, it was knocked up in a day or two right at the end of production, is unbelievable looking, especially on here. In the end, Myth, in all of its 8-bit versions, shows off just what the 8-bit systems can do in good hands. The Amstrad version also warrants a mention, being another excellent port in much the same vein of the Speccy version. It's pretty definitively an 8-bit game too. It ended up taking quite a weird turn on the 16-bits. How so? Well, System-3 naturally tried to sell the game in America, and they succeeded, striking a deal with Mindscape. But Mindscape weren't feeling the whole normal teenage boy thing, so they stuck, of all things, Conan the Barbarian in it. And so we get Conan the Mysteries of Time, which ended up appearing on the NES in America, where it never got much of a good reception. Strangely enough, the Amiga port of the game, as well as the Atari ST port, which never ended up getting released, went more in the Conan direction as opposed to the direction of the original, and it's a much lesser game on the 16-bit systems because of it. And so the 8-bit micros are the only way to play this late gem, and seriously, it is utterly recommended that you do, especially the staggering achievement that is the Speccy version. Tusker from 1989 is another System-3 arcade adventure, and it's one of the more obscure ones. In this title, everything goes a little bit Indiana Jones. You go through 3 stages of desert, caves and jungle, battling with various minions and evil spirits, on a mission to complete your dad's quest. Tusker is far from as well remembered as System-3's other efforts in the genre, and you know what, there's not much about it that sticks out an awful lot. Obviously the technical standard is still high, and the music's pretty good, no surprise there, but it doesn't play as well as most of the company's other efforts at this time. It would probably be a better game in the hands of another studio. For System-3, Tusker feels kind of derivative and generic. It's not a bad game at all, just not a memorable one. Moving a little bit away from the action adventures, we have a more arcadey game from System-3, the absolutely fantastic Flimbo's Quest, released in 1990. This game, an affair filled with production from guys who were in the demo scene such as Lawrence van der Donk, didn't get a whole lot of love from the gaming press when it came out, but it seems to have held up quite well over time. The game is quite simple. You play as Flimbo, and you rescue your girlfriend from an evil professor with the help of a wizard. The wizard needs scrolls in order to help you out, and you collect them by getting them off specific enemies. The enemy in question will be flashing when you see it, and helpfully there's a display at the bottom that shows you the type of enemy you've got to kill. A lot of Flimbo's Quest is about quickly learning a level and figuring out where certain enemies spawn from. It gets harder over time as enemies appear in much tighter windows, or they could be a lot faster than you, thus requiring some sort of power-up. And the whole game is on a timer that always needs attention. You can always get 2 extra minutes from the wizard, but naturally you need money to do so. This isn't exactly the longest of games, there's only 7 levels in the whole thing, but what's here has the usual System-3 panache, in that it's strikingly well presented, and there's also some excellent music thanks to the Maniacs of Noise, in other words Jerome Tell. It's a nice little breeze of a game, and certainly quite different to a lot of the other System-3 titles that tended to be more gritty and dark. It is, I suppose, kind of a precursor perhaps to more famous games like Putty that we'll be seeing later on, and it's very enjoyable indeed. Check this one out if you've never played it. Here's a quicker one. Turbocharge is one of the last System-3 games for the C64, coming out as late as 1991. It's not one of their most famous ones, and that's not really surprising because, well, it's perhaps the most derivative title we've seen from them so far. You play as a pair of agents who get in their car and have to hunt down a bunch of terrorists in Iraq who are stealing missiles and generally causing mischief. You blast everyone that you see on the road with impunity. They're all criminals and they're all guilty. The crime is life and the sentence is death. This game looks fine and everything, of course, but the whole thing's just pretty eh. I say that it's derivative because honestly, it feels a fair bit too similar to Chase HQ 2 or Special Criminal Investigation or whatever you want to call it. The same mix of driving and shooting, the same eventual goal of chasing down and gradually destroying a lead car. There's not a whole lot else to the game other than that, and in the end, alas, it's just a bit boring. While System-3 did a pretty good job in general of saying goodbye to the C64, sticking with their brand of original titles, they weren't entirely immune from the lesser games that often tend to define a studio's output at the end of a system's life. When you see the name Vendetta, you might cast your mind immediately to the famous IRM beat-em-up from the arcades. However, this is not that. Vendetta is another original System-3 work from 1990, and a game that takes place in a format that's quite familiar. Basically, it's the studio's other isometric action adventure, as previously seen of course in The Last Ninja. This game was developed, as mentioned, by the late Stan Schembri, and while it does look similar to The Last Ninja, it doesn't quite use the same engine. Schembri rewrote it a fair bit. The reworked engine, as used in this game, would then be used later on in The Last Ninja 3, also headed by Schembri. As another game in a style that had made System-3 a pretty considerable amount of money by this point, Vendetta was highly rated by the press at the time it came out, although it doesn't seem to be that remembered these days. In the game you're tasked with foiling another terrorist plot, and you play as a character who, well, kind of looks a little bit like Arnold Schwarzenegger, don't you think? There's a fair bit of punching and kicking, but there's also a lot of shooting. You pick up guns fairly quickly, and you're going to want to use them a lot of the time, especially on the multitude of enemies who unfairly also have guns at their disposal. Other than that, there's naturally items to grab and puzzles to solve, much like The Last Ninja. On the whole, it's okay. The game does have fans amongst those who do remember it, but I don't really jive with this one as much as I do with the Last Ninja games. It often kind of feels like a pain in the arse, with some pretty unfair sections that cast your mind all the way back to the original Last Ninja. It's important in that it obviously gave Schembri the grounding needed to then go in and make a perfectly good third and final Last Ninja game, but this first run through, doing something a little bit different, for me it just misses the mark. Curiously, there is almost a hint that the plan for Schembri was always to get him on that third Last Ninja game. How does Vendetta end? Well, it ends with a final standoff in, of all places, Central Park. Perhaps they're set in the same universe. A flawed title then, but certainly a curious one. Finally, to end on an incredibly high note, we have to look at the sequel to International Karate. Archer McLean originally took a flawed title and managed to beat it into completion. Now he has a sequel where he's completely in control. The result is the classic IK Plus from 1987, which you may know as Chop and Drop if you're American. The main inspiration for Archer was when Activision asked him about his thoughts on what he would like to see in a fighting game, and he said that he'd like to see the other fighters on the floor while you take on the next opponent. And from there, suddenly, he had a eureka moment. A brilliant idea for a sequel to International Karate that he just knew was going to work. The main thing about IK Plus, of course, is that the number of fighters has increased from 2 to 3. Instead of a more traditional karate bout, you now have an incredibly fast-paced bout where these 3 fighters constantly attack each other. The fighting doesn't stop when someone gets knocked down, it only stops when the timer reaches 0 or one of the fighters reaches a certain amount of points. You, as the white player, simply have to survive and thrive. You continue on so long as you're not the last placed of the 3 whenever play stops. As with the original, play is broken up with mini-games. Here there's 2, one where you deflect balls with a shield, and another where you kick away random bombs. These changes to the original formula quite simply make for a total classic, the best fighting game released before Street Fighter 2, as far as I'm concerned. Everything has been improved. Even if there is only one background, it's beautiful, evocative and filled with quite amusing Easter eggs. The animations are so much tighter now, painstakingly created and often cribbed from movies and the like. The backflip comes from Grease, for example, and the splits kick is from Jackie Chan in the Cannonball one. Rob Hubbard sticks one of his all-time best ever tunes into the game as well, just to really cement its quality. This is just a game that you can play over and over again, just to relax and get into the mode. Even when you lose, you can literally start all over again in a second. There's even some rather fun little cheat codes to play with, such as the one that removes the fighter's pants. It's wonderful. It deserved all the success, not to mention all the ports and all the updates of the game that took IK Plus into the 90s and even beyond. Even as fighting games continued to progress technically, there was still a definite appetite for this. It won't surprise anyone for me to say that IK Plus is, of all System-3's games, my personal favourite. I absolutely love it. Okay, with the end of System-3's fantastic run on the C64, we've reached a pretty good place to finish part 1. There's a lot more to talk about in part 2. As mentioned, there's the switch away from Activision, but there's also other things, such as a brilliant new IP that enjoyed several games, including an Amiga one that reached legendary status of a sort. There's the reason that System-3 managed to survive in the 32-bit era when lots of other studios didn't. There's the story of how incredibly prolific they were in the PS2 days, and of course, we're going to wrap it all up with their legacy and their continued survival to this day. Hopefully you'll join me for the second part of this great company's story, but until then, as ever, I shall say bye for now. When we left System-3, we had just about wrapped up a look at their work on the 8-bit microcomputers, in particular the Commodore 64, a system that they were unquestionably masters on. What System-3 didn't know about the C64, quite frankly, wasn't worth knowing. But still, eventually, they would have to move on to the 16-bits. As time goes on, System-3's output becomes a little less prolific perhaps than it was in the 8-bit days, but there's still some quite important games to look at as we go through this second part. Perhaps most important of all, there's a game that was quite a long time in the making. Close to 20 years to be exact. For now though, we go back to 1990. As System-3 attempt to find their place in the 16-bit world, they end up having to break with the company that was, perhaps, their most important partner. As detailed in part 1, a very important part of System-3's early success was getting into bed with a big American partner, in their case, Activision. The start of this relationship was mainly thanks to plenty of fast talking by Mark Cale, but it soon translated into successful games. By the end of the 1980s, System-3 were one of Activision's leading moneymakers. In fact, it's estimated that in 1988 and 1989, System-3 were responsible for as much as 80% of the company's global revenue. Unfortunately, that wasn't all that much, considering the utterly shocking state of Activision at this time. It's kind of hard to think about it today, but the world of computing came pretty close to not having Activision at all come the end of the 1980s. A number of things, great and small, hurt them endlessly, especially in the years after the North American video game crash. Their status as gaming's first third-party publishers, confirmed in 1982 after the successful victory in court against Atari, soon meant that other companies joined them and, soon enough, overtook them. Their games just weren't too hot in the mid-late 80s. They suffered losses in the courtroom of their own. In particular, they were sued by Magnavox in 1985, who accused them of copying their ancient but watertight patents on games based on sports such as tennis and Grand Prix racing. These patents dated back to the original Odyssey, and were the same ones that allowed them to grab a piece of Atari's big old pond pie. But despite how much things had changed since then, they still worked. A move to change the name of the business to Mediagenic didn't do any favours, and decisions like purchasing alien adventure giants Infocom were just plain disastrous. After years of losses, Activision was staring at the proverbial writing on the wall. The relationship between Activision and System-3 had pretty much always been good. Indeed, System-3 had occasionally stepped in to work on certain games for Activision. Sure, the end result of this may have been licensed guff like Predator, but they'd done the Americans favours. But their own returns were diminishing, with System-3 starting to not see the full amount of money they believed they were owed from the success of their games in the States. And so, in 1990, System-3 made the decision to leave what, at the time, appeared to be a sinking ship. It's kinda obviously the right move to make, even if no one could have predicted what happened next. In December of 1990, a young man by the name of Bobby Kotick buys the company and over the course of many years not only saves it, but turns Activision into an industry juggernaut. His methods may have been controversial, but the man unquestionably saves Activision from certain doom. System-3's decision to leave probably isn't a big what-if as far as this story goes. Even if they had stayed on board, Kotick's immediate move to radically restructure Activision and draw it down to a skeleton staff probably ends the relationship between the two companies anyway. It's a footnote to an important transitional period in the history of a very large company indeed, although it is a part of System-3 making a slightly awkward transition to being a fully 16-bit company. Another part of this being their involvement in a failed machine that never ended up getting released. Writing about System-3 is as good a time as any to talk about the Konix multisystem. This is only tangentially related in all honesty, but it deserves a look into, especially as System-3 did back the system quite heavily both with games and in the press. Anyway, how do I best sum it up? Well, there's this well-used example of a doomed business. I think I'm cribbing this from the late Anthony Bourdain, mainly. The middle-class professional, perhaps a doctor in his late 40s or early 50s, who always gives good dinner parties. His friends keep on telling him that he should open a restaurant, because his food is so good. And eventually, he believes his own hype. He sees that one spot which has been in the hands of about 12 other restaurants open up, and he swoops in. He's in the restaurant business. And nothing can prepare our poor hero, Mr. Dinner Party, for the myriad of horrors that await, the thousands of other factors that come with actually being in the restaurant business. People do not come. He loses money. All his money. He's quit his well-paying job and pours God knows what else into the business. All the savings, all the loans and more to try and make the thing work. But it doesn't. It has to shut, leaving our once comfortable and successful professional virtually bankrupt and destitute. All because he could cook and because Karen told him he should open his own restaurant. Thanks, Karen. Anyway, this belaboured analogy is something of a metaphor for a company that was, at one time, a perfectly good maker of peripherals and controllers. That was Konix, a thoroughly dependable British name. A joystick you can rely on, that's what they did. Until they came up with this one peripheral called Slipstream, which to be fair sounds quite good. It was a serious step up, an advanced bit of kit that could be reconfigured for various complex games. It could be a steering wheel, or motorbike handles, or even an aircraft yoke. It would even have force feedback, which was something that was kind of unheard of in controllers back in the late 1980s. A really awesome bit of kit then. But, well, Konix and the controller's designer, Win Holloway, saw the potential for it to be more than just a controller. They saw that actually Slipstream was so advanced that it could form a basis for a computer in its own right. Now, while Konix didn't have any experience in making computers, they partnered up with people who did, a company called Flare Technology, made up of former Sinclair research bods, who were working on a computer design called the Flare 1. The pair matched up and the process of integrating the two began, with the end result set to be a 16-bit system roughly comparable in power to the Amiga and the Atari ST. It used floppies, was capable of 4096 colours with 256 on display at any one time, had about a megabyte of total memory, you know, all the good stuff. Along with plenty of other things that Win Holloway had thought to include. Everything from a proper moving chair that responded to gameplay, to a light gun with proper recoil. The base system itself was set to retail at £200 when all was said and done, and originally it was due to hit the shelves sometime in August of 1989, with as many as 40 games available on launch. So, well, what happened? It's not fair at all to say that the Konix was a complete failure or that it was a whole load of empty promises. It doesn't qualify as vaporware because dev kits do actually exist for the machine. Plenty of names had been brought on board. System-3 were there of course, along with the likes you'd expect such as Ocean, not to mention luminaries like the almighty Jeff Minter, but big names from across the pond were also sniffing around. Lucasfilm were very interested indeed in the Konix. There was plenty of good hype in UK magazines too, the likes of Ace and The Games Machine all doing plenty of reporting, all a nice, multi-platform mags. There's even a video out there promoting the Conix. But every time the release date got too close, it'd get delayed again. And again. And again. Quite simply, Conix didn't have enough money. The ideas were good and the support was there, but the manufacture of the system? It was beyond them. The costs just kept piling up, and it was far more than a simple manufacture of computer peripherals could take. They'd spread themselves way, way too thin. By the end of 1989, rumours spread that Conix were close to hitting the wall, with development on the system having crawled to a standstill. By March of 1990, Conix made a last drastic play to go all in on the multisystem. They actually sold off their range of joysticks to Spectravision, one of their main competitors. You know, what's called selling the family silver. But that wasn't nearly enough. The demise of former software giants Epix also didn't help. They'd owed Conix a considerable amount of cash, presumably over Epix's licensing of Conix's Speedkin joystick. Finally, the project officially died in the summer of 1990 or so, with the bankruptcy of Conix itself. Sadly, while dev kits for the Conix do exist as mentioned, no actual completed system was ever created. So rather unfortunate. Flare Technology did a bit better, taking their services to Atari, with the end result of that partnership being the Flare 2, which formed the basis for the Atari Jaguar. From the perspective of System-3, and indeed from the perspective of many other British companies who got involved in the Conix multisystem, it was certainly a project that had been worth going with. It would have absolutely been the most serious attempt to create a full-on British games console, and there's certainly a lot about it that would have turned heads. System-3 themselves were down to port Last Ninja 2 to the Conix, but some of the other speculation on what the machine would have been actually capable of was pretty wild, and some of the ideas that Conix and Win Holloway came up with were considerably ahead of their time. Alas, it just wasn't to be. One wonders how much all of this finagling with Activision, Conix and so on affects System-3's output. While business is still all fine, they've certainly become a bit less prolific on the 16-bit machines than they were on the old Commodore 64. Still, let's have a proper look at their 16-bit output. So there is one pretty obvious place to start off with when it comes to System-3's 16-bit games, that being the 16-bit versions of their 8-bit games. A lot of them did actually come out for the Amiga and the Atari ST too, after all. Having a quick look at a lot of the 16-bit versions, mind you, yeah, they're mostly better on the C64. The C64 was absolutely System-3's main platform for a long time, and a lot of the C64 versions of System-3's games are, indeed, better than the 16-bit versions. The Last Ninja games are a pretty good example. The classic SID soundtrack of Last Ninja 2 doesn't quite translate to the Amiga's Paula chip, and the gameplay just feels kind of unresponsive. It's a similar story with the likes of Dominator or Bangkok Nights, and Myth in particular. Well, the graphics oddly take their cue from the Conanified NES version, and in all honesty, it's kinda poor. Even Ninja Remix, a System-3 made 16-bit port of the original Last Ninja, pales in comparison to playing it on the C64. Now, they're not all bad. Flimbo's Quest is still quite good on the Amiga, although it is better on the C64, and the Amiga version of IK+, which actually has a banning's upgraded soundtrack while still being as fast and furious as ever, is surely the definitive way to play the game. But on the whole, yeah, a lot of the System-3 games we've already seen in Part 1 are best played on the original C64 as opposed to the Amiga or ST. Now that's not too much of a surprise perhaps. The real difference makers here are the original games that System-3 made for the 16-bit platforms. But surprisingly, there's only like 4 of those. System-3's output really seemed to slow down in the early mid-90s for whatever reason. Perhaps you'd expect this level of output from a company that was still independent and still pretty small at the end of the day, only ever retaining a close-knit team of employees. But it's a surprising lull considering just how prolific they were on the 8-bit machines. We do certainly have good titles to look at though. I really like Fuzzball from 1991. This is a single-screen platform-stroke puzzle game where you have to collect all the items on screen while also dealing with all the enemies. Generic enough, I suppose, The main challenge comes from having to really time the lines of enemies so that as soon as you start shooting them, you can grab them. They only stay inactive for a few seconds, during which time you've got to reach them. It's no good sniping away at them because you've got to get right in as close as possible to kill the whole line before they respawn. Other than that, it's puzzling the rest of the stage out, dealing with timing bits, jumping bits, and so on and so forth. It's a lot of fun. I only wish the controls were a bit more responsive, but other than that, it's a really nice game that seems to be completely forgotten nowadays. Kinda like, say, Quack by Team 17. And like that game, I definitely recommend it. Up next, well, we actually have an 8-bit title that I almost forgot to include. Not exactly a big one, but it is worth mentioning. Ferrari Grand Prix Challenge. So, we have a bit of an odd timeline here, I think. We start off with a completely different Japanese Mega Drive game called F1 Hero, one of the more challenging and realistic sims of the day. Well, on console anyway. This game gets released in the West by Flying Edge as Ferrari Grand Prix Challenge, and then, oddly enough, a completely different game again also gets released as Ferrari Grand Prix Challenge on the NES by System-3. It's a pretty late NES game, coming out in 1992 and, well, it's a pretty generic F1 racer. Not actually that bad or anything, the music's quite cool and the controls are all perfectly fine and all that. The most interesting thing about this game, however, is that it's not the last time that the names of System-3 and Ferrari will be intertwined. But we'll get into that later on. Much later on, actually. While we're on Nintendo machines, it's also worth quickly mentioning a Japanese game by Seta called Desert Fighter, which System-3 published in the West under the name ASP Auto Strike Patrol. This is a perfectly okay game. In many ways it's like one of the Strike games, only you're in a jet fighter. Thankfully it's a lot more controllable than that one jet fighter section of Jungle Strike was. Although it is certainly bloody challenging. You get shot at from all angles, you have to try and fly super low in order to shoot most things or get them with your missiles, and usually another enemy plane will be on your tail, requiring plenty of evasive manoeuvring. It's not easy, but quite a fun game. And again, one that's worth mentioning, because it's also one of the first times that System-3 would look to Japan in order to find something they could publish in the West. And it definitely wouldn't be the last, as we will see later. So, at the moment, System-3's output in the 16-bit era looks a little thin on the ground. There's other games that they were working on too at the time, some that would come to fruition and others that would not. But there was a big critical and commercial hit game also. Even if they didn't release many games in the early 90s, System-3 found a smash on the Amiga with Putty. Originally dubbed Silly Putty in magazines before its release in 1992, you are tasked with rescuing bots that will help you build a skyscraper that will take Putty all the way back to his home planet. Needless to say, our hero is quite flexible. He can stretch from one platform to another, inflate and destroy all the enemies on the screen, he can make a fist, crouch into a pool, he has a few good tricks at his disposal. Putty is quite the chaotic game. Each level has several bots that need to be rescued and it can all be quite manic. It's so colourful and so clashy that it can be a bit hard sometimes to actually tell what's going on. It's not exactly the cleanest game ever made. It's a very European game indeed. We've got all those garish colours, we've got nice animation, but we've also got quite the annoying delay on Putty's jump, and lots of loud sound effects. It's all quite irreverent and funny in presentation, although I'm not sure how appealing it might be these days for someone who hasn't ever played it. That may depend on your mileage for games like, I don't know, Zool. If I'm honest, I would be lying if I said that Putty was one of my favourite games. I've never got into it all that much. But magazines definitely enjoyed it, and it was certainly System-3's biggest success on the Amiga, certainly since the Commodore 64 days. Indeed, Putty also got a port to consoles. Well, to the Super NES anyway. US Gold had a hand in this. I actually prefer playing Putty, or rather Super Putty as it's known here because back then every single Super Nintendo game had to have the Super prefix by law, on the SNES, mainly because it runs at 50 frames per second. That extra smoothness sure makes it a bit easier to figure out what's going on, and you can also choose your zone. Still, again, it's not a game that I massively enjoy. But hey, lots of people certainly do. Putty would go on to be one of System-3's biggest names, something that would follow them around for years to come, right there with IK and The Last Ninja. So, you know, don't just take my word for it. Naturally, the success of Putty meant that a sequel to the game was basically assured, and indeed 1994 saw the announcement of said sequel, Putty Squad. Putty Squad was going to be a different sort of game, perhaps a bit more of a traditional side-scrolling platformer in many ways, as opposed to the original Putty, which was more vertically inclined. But our hero would still have to rescue a bunch of his mates in the classic European style, and he would not only have all the tools from the original at his disposal, but plenty more besides. System-3 naturally bigged the game up heftily, and the magazines were very receptive indeed. It reviewed superbly in around about September of 1994. Most of the big magazines, from the generally easygoing CU Amiga to the hard nuts at Amiga Power, were effusive, happily handing out 90s, and the demo of a couple of levels that also appeared on a couple of cover discs certainly whetted the fans' appetite. But then, mysteriously, Putty Squad for the Amiga never came out. This despite all the advertising, being reviewed everywhere, and all sorts like that. The Putty Squad fiasco seems to be linked to Amiga Power most of all, which isn't exactly fair as, again, every magazine reviewed it. But Amiga Power were the ones who always claimed that they would never, ever review an unfinished game, unlike some mags. So people were now wondering why they reviewed it if there was now such a delay, or indeed, as the months went by, now that it was becoming clearer that Putty Squad wasn't going to come out for the Amiga at all. Again, they were all rather baffled. The truth was that Amiga Power hadn't broken one of their key tenets. They had reviewed a finished copy of the game, same as everyone else. It was all done up and ready to go, but then seemingly, at the very last minute, considering the rapidly faltering state of the Amiga, this being a time when Commodore had just gone bust and everything was completely uncertain, System-3 made the decision to not release Putty Squad. Thing is, it gets strange from there. The collective response of magazines to Putty Squad not coming out on the Amiga was seemingly to pretend that it had. You can go back to Amiga magazines from months, even a year or so after the supposed release of Putty Squad in September 1994, and still find the game in their sort of bottom line sum up sections, like, oh, we reviewed this, 90%, we heartily recommend it, even though it wasn't on the shelves, even though it had never been on the shelves. And in the end, in the very twilight days of the Amiga, 1998-1999, you had companies, incredibly unsavoury companies run by charlatans, who advertised in magazines like Amiga Format that they were selling Putty Squad, even though they did not have the software at all, even though these companies had gone to Mark Cale of System-3 and said, hey, do you want to give Putty Squad to us, and had been flatly refused. They were still advertising Putty Squad for sale in magazines. And needless to say, if you gave those companies any kind of money, well, you probably weren't going to get much back. What confidence trickstering arseholes. I mean, people say that games journalism's shit now. You have no idea. You have no idea. Try looking back to the twilight days of the Amiga. In the end, there was only one platform that you could play Putty Squad on at the time, that being the SNES. Even here, the game still doesn't necessarily feel like it's all the way finished, with certain things being a bit haphazard and rushed, like, say, the ending, but gameplay and design-wise it's certainly complete. And yeah, it's quite a good game actually. I much prefer playing Putty Squad to the original, which probably isn't the popular opinion, but I find that this game gives me just a little bit more room to breathe, while the original just has way too much going on for me. It feels like a perfectly well-made platformer. Nothing massively special, but quite fun to be getting on with. I don't recall it particularly setting the world on fire on the SNES. Again, when Putty Squad is mentioned, people tend to think of the whole Amiga kerfuffle around it, as opposed to its actual release on this platform. But in the end, not a bad game. And of course, it won't be the last time we'll see Putty. But that is basically it for System-3's 16-bit output. And, well, there's not much there, is there? Certainly when compared to the 8-bit era, when System-3 were absolutely at the forefront of things on the C64, particularly from the technical perspective, they most definitely didn't kick on in the 16-bit era. Again, they are, of course, a small company, one that mostly concerns itself with taking people and projects on a freelance basis, so maybe this is to be expected. But looking back on it all, it didn't necessarily bode well for the 32-bit era. the time when a lot of UK and European companies, including some big names, would start running into serious trouble. However, System-3 would find a way to keep on and make waves, not just through finding games to publish either, but actually through another hit game. The 32-bit era, and the jump to 3D that by and large came with it, resulted in an aggressive and rapid changing of the guards. A lot of the companies that would have been considered the big cheesers in the early part of the decade suddenly are staring defeat in the face. Ocean, at one time the biggest software company in Europe and actually one of the biggest in the world, do not last out the 90s. US Gold go even sooner than that, quickly seeing the writing on the wall and making a decision to sell up before things get worse. Sensible Software, one of the most loved and critically acclaimed studios of them all, fizzle out of action. Either older names, such as Psygnosis, reaping the rewards of a partnership with the all-conquering Sony, maintain their place on the top, or other names come screeching out from the peloton. The company that was once the utterly middling, never ever loved Demark, merge with Eidos, and thanks to the likes of Tomb Raider, they become a juggernaut, with core design riding alongside them and taking their place amongst the critical darlings. Codemasters make the leap from budget Kins to a strong studio. Bullfrog, while Peter Molyneux is still there at least, remain loved, for now. It's a brutal time where only the strong survived. And considering that System-3 were a pretty small name and not one that had done too much over the past couple of years, you may not have given them much of a chance. It'd have only taken one silly decision to ruin things. And yet, System-3 would keep on, and in fact do so seemingly quite comfortably. How did they do it? Well, the most obvious thing that you would look at perhaps would be an attempt to bring back some of their hit names from the past. What of games like International Karate or The Last Ninja? Should they be brought back for a new generation, given a big old polygonal coat of paint and sent off to fend for themselves? That seems like a potential path, but it didn't happen. However, there were attempts. We know of a few attempts to make a fourth Last Ninja game. A man named John Wells pitched a fourth game to System-3 as early as 1993, in fact, but they turned him down. However, the idea was returned to, more seriously this time, in around about 1999, all according to Unseen64. Information about the project, which hung around for a long time, is scarce. It did eventually make an appearance at E3 in 2003, and in many ways it does look like a similar game to Tecmo's revival of Ninja Gaiden, which would have been intriguing. Had this game arrived, it and Ninja Gaiden would have probably come out at around about the same time. Now I doubt that Ninja Gaiden, as brilliant a game as that was, would have lost that battle, but still the fight would have been on. In any case, however, it didn't happen. Mark Cale did make some quite outlandish claims in the press, saying that in the end the Xbox and PS2 actually weren't powerful enough for what System-3 had planned for the game, and that it would ultimately be really good on the PlayStation 3. And of course it never came out there either. Armakuni would stay hidden then as he stays hidden now. We're jumping a little ahead, so let's go back a little further. What about IK? There was an attempt there too. There were, of course, some sort of sequels for handhelds, which we'll get to in a bit, but there was also work done on a bigger sequel known as either IK3 or Bloodlust. System-3 were working on this, with the end result to be released by Atari, it seems. The game would have come out for the PlayStation as well as going into the arcades, and from screenshots it seems to be a more traditional fighting game, with Killer Instinct touted as a particularly major inspiration by programmer Andy Roberts. It's not exactly clear why the project failed. Some reports have it as being quite close to finished, and word is that a few people do possess prototypes of the game that as of yet remain unreleased. But ultimately, this project bit the dust in around about the middle of '96. So much for these old games then. For System-3's next success, we go to a game that had been kicking around their offices for quite a while. In fact, an Amiga version of said game was previewed and screenshotted in the One magazine all the way back in early 1991. That also never came out, but the concept would be revived and released in 1997 when it would end up being a surprise smash. It's time to have a look at Constructor. So looking at System-3's output so far, what do you see? I mean, it's pretty much all action games and platformers, isn't it? A couple of racing games too, but in general, they're firmly a studio that produces arcade-style games. Just about the last thing you would expect from them is a city building sim that has more in common with the works of Bullfrog than it does with what they've done before. But here we are. Constructor is totally unlike anything System 3 have done up to this point, and the freshness of the project leads to what was, in all honesty, their best title in years and a deservedly large hit. Particularly on the continent, this game was huge to the point where it's right up there with the biggest games that System 3 have ever released. How does Constructor stand out from the crowd of other city building games then? Well, it's kind of in the title. Rather than putting you in charge of an all-powerful godlike government that can basically do anything they want a la SimCity, in Constructor you're in charge of a construction firm. In order to build anything, you're going to need employees and work gans, you're going to need resources through mills and the like, and you're going to need to buy land from the government, which you can't just do willy-nilly. When you build a house, or indeed any structure, it's up to you to find tenants or people for it, and then try and keep it maintained. Gadget factories can help you build stuff that makes properties more appealing, say computers that'll make tenants smarter and thus keener to move up in the world and buy better housing, while you make sure you use as much of the land you have as possible. Leaving plots of land barren and unused will cause consternation in the halls of power. And you know what the big kicker is? You're not the only construction firm in town. You're in competition with several other firms, and it's a cutthroat business. You may want to get in league with the mob, as they can help you get some muscle to perhaps sabotage the competition's major projects, break strikes by bonking some heads together, or deal with other undesirables such as, say, squatters. There's a lot of things to manage, in other words, and you've got to do all of that whilst avoiding anything that could potentially get you sacked or, well, worse. The big competition streak can make Constructor quite a tough game to get to grips with, especially early on and if you're used to other sims of this type where you just build stuff and then basically forget about it. Here the actual care of buildings is very important. If you don't care for them, they'll become infested with bugs, they'll set on fire frequently, tenants will complain which will potentially leave you with black marks on the government's list, thus making it harder to do any business, or hell, the houses will just frickin' explode. You've got to try and run a smoother, slower operation at first, as opposed to doing the usual thing and building as much stuff as you can as quick as you can. Make sure you can actually manage what you've got before going crazy with expansion. And of course, bolster up your defences against potential enemies. This is a ruthless world. Hell, the opening video features some poor foreman getting buried alive in cement. It's all jolly nice and cartoony, but it certainly shows the game's vicious streak of violent capitalism. It makes the outwardly cheery yet cold and calculating theme park look like little more than a wet day at the pier in terms of ruthlessness and utterly dark humour. On the whole, yeah, it's a bloody good game. The move to something completely different worked well for System 3. Aside from the 3D animated videos, it also allowed them to keep their feet more in the 2D world for development, thus not spending them tons of money on upgrading everything to create full 3D stuff. Coming out in 1997, it was part of a bunch of games that helped to show that not everything had to be fully 3D, and there was certainly still room for good games that were mostly two-dimensional, and the reception for it was justifiably excellent. Needless to say, there would be a sequel a couple of years later. In 1999, System 3 released Mob Rule, or Street Wars here in the UK. This is kind of a spin-off. The game's set in 1930s America, and this time around you play as a mob boss. You've still got the big old construction aspect, of course, but needless to say there's plenty more shady and violent things that you can do here. It's quite a harsh game. It's just as challenging as Constructor, it's not the easiest of games to pick up, and there's even more details and complexities that you're gonna have to learn with not much explanation. As a result, the game didn't get nearly as good a reception as the original Constructor, but it is one of those games that does have a dedicated if small fan base. Perhaps because there just aren't too many games out there like this one. As a sequel, it certainly does the concept justice, and both of these games make for a nice, fond farewell from System 3, by and large, to computers. From here on out, they're largely going to be concentrating on consoles, in the main, the Sony PlayStation line. And it's not going to be too long before they get pretty prolific again. Generally speaking, we've mostly got games to cover for now. A lot of the big story beats for the actual company have been covered. System 3 secure a minor but consistent existence in the PlayStation era thanks to a couple of things. There's some development, usually under a new brand called Studio-3, but there's also the importing of games from Japan, including some names that would become pretty well known. Not all the Japanese games they bring are necessarily good, but they definitely contain some hits. They're also getting more prolific here on the PS1, although not yet as seriously prolific as they would be in the later years of the PS2. We'll have a lot of games to look at then, believe me. For now, we've got some little PS1 stuff to cover, plus a couple of handheld games. The handheld games are new, well, sort of new, versions of International Karate that come out for both the Game Boy Color and the Game Boy Advance. You now get a cast of characters to pick from in this version, although naturally they all play exactly the same. You can even play as a man named Biffo from London. Named after Mr. Biffo perhaps? Who knows. Other than that, well, it's classic International Karate mainly, and it plays absolutely fine for IK on the go. The GBA version has the free-man setup from IK+, although the moves are more like the original. It's all good really. Aside from the Spectrum version from ages ago, it's kind of hard to screw this game up. There is also a regular conversion of IK Plus for the GBA, although I don't believe this had anything to do with System-3, it was more Arch McLean's own thing, released for Ignition. System-3 also, at some point, took custody of one of the great heroes of UK platforming, James Pond, and they set about releasing James Pond 2 for the PlayStation. Now, this is kind of strange. Looking at the title, you might assume that this is just a flat-out port of the original Robocod for the PS1. It's actually not. It's a remake that could actually be called more of a remix. The themes of the levels are similar to the original, but the stage layouts are entirely different. This is kind of the case with a fair few of the later Robocod ports that are kicking about, but for whatever reason most of them are named James Pond 2, so everybody thinks that they're just ports of the original. Someone should get on that already. In any case, if you've played the original game to death, well, this may provide a little bit more fishy fun for you. It's James Pond at the end of the day. Speaking of games that were originally by Millennium, System-3 also released Creatures Raised in Space for the PS1, an artificial life sort of game where you try to teach creatures, obviously, how to perform tasks ranging from the simple to the complex. This sort of game isn't usually my thing at all, but Creatures certainly does have fans out there who might perhaps wish to check out this more obscure entry in the series. System-3's other PlayStation 1 games start off a new approach for them, importing games from Japan. We've got 4 of these to start off with, and we'll have plenty more to look at on the PS2 in the next chapter. They're not exactly all winners. Crisis Beat, a game originally by Taito, is a very bland 3D beat-em-up. The best thing I could say about it is that it plays like a poor man's Dynamite Deca, and if I really wanted to be uncharitable about it, I'd say that it plays like a poor man's Fighting Force. It's slow and ungainly, and there are much better games of this type around. There's also Toshinden 4, the first of a few games that System-3 would release that were originally by Takara. Toshinden 4 is the last game of a series that started out with the PS1's very first fighting game. This weapon-based fighter had definitely gotten better since then, although it was still pretty far behind the top-tier PS1 fighting games like Tekken, Soul Blade or Rival Schools. It's not awful, I suppose, not particularly great either. The first entry in Arc System Works' Guilty Gear series, also published by System-3, is quite clearly a lot better. A fair few people probably do know this one, seeing as it's the start of a much more famous fighting game series. The 2D graphics are naturally quite lovely, the fighting's excellent and certainly a bit different from the other big names. Yeah, it's good. A bit of a classic, some might say. But of this original quartet of Japanese games System-3 published for the PS1, there's no contest as to which is best. They published one of the system's absolute gems. The sort that has been called a hidden gem so much it's not exactly obscure anymore. The utterly fantastic Silent Bomber. Originally by CyberConnect, this is a belter of an action title where you run around planting bombs on anything that dares to attack you, while also hitting targets, fighting bosses and the like. It's a bit complex, you have to get used to holding the button to specifically target enemies, which is more efficient than just hoping they'll run into a bomb's path, while there's also a bunch of evasive moves and power-ups to be getting on with as well. It's fast-paced and frantic in a way that easily still holds up today, perhaps because there still aren't too many games like it. It's a shame that really there weren't any further Silent Bomber games for the PS2 or whatever, as it's such a cool concept. Anyway, you absolutely should play this if you haven't. It's awesome. And just like that, we move on to the PlayStation 2. And there's not much time to mess about, because suddenly we have a lot more games to cover. In the PS2 era, System-3 kept moving along. They changed their name to Play It for a few years, operated as a budget studio, and released a lot of games. We're hardly short of stuff to get through. Some of these games are actually good, some are bad and cheap, some are cool Japanese imports, and some are super casual to the point of not having much about them at all. But there's certainly a whole range of games to look at. Of the more slight games, well, there's things like Video Poker and Blackjack, or Chess Challenger, or Crazy Chicken X that are kind of exactly what they say on the tin. Crazy Chicken is a little shooting gallery sort of game that goes on for literally a minute. We have other quite slight games too. Super Fruitful, which I believe was developed in-house, is a game where you move one of those slidey puzzles around and try to group the different pieces of fruit together. You know, those slidey puzzles you used to get in boxes of cereal and the like. It's a very casual game, although hardly a terrible one. Again, it's a budget title, and I can't imagine that any of these games were selling for more than a few quid down the local supermarket, so yeah. See also Arcade Classics Volume 1, which features unofficial versions of, well, arcade classics. We've got thoroughly average takes on Asteroids, Missile Command, Space Invaders, Galaxian, Centipede, Defender. Not great, but it's a few quid. Some of these games are pretty terrible, mind. A lot of these ones tend to be American imports, usually provided by the likes of Crave. Strikeforce Bowling is about the best of their lot, and, well, it's 10-pin bowling. Other than that, you get the likes of Underworld: The Eternal War. This game, the first tie-in for that series of blue-tinted vampire action films starring Kate Beckinsale, is as dumbed down an arena shooter as you can possibly get. Like, you wouldn't even compare this favourably to Enter the Matrix. We've also got Triggerman, which is some sort of really cheap mafia-type game, third-person shooter crap. Grand Theft Auto this is not. It's as boring as it looks. But the king of all these bad games has to be Fugitive Hunter War on Terror, which is also known as America's 10 Most Wanted. It's a really, really bad, and in fact ridiculously comical first-person shooter where your mission, if you choose to accept it, is to take down and arrest the world's 10 most wanted men, culminating in a fight between the ultra-evil super tag team of Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein. It honestly doesn't get much more budget game schlock than this, from the lousy gameplay to the gloriously offensive stereotypes. I mean, if there was such a thing as post-9/11 aesthetic, this would be a centrepiece of that. Thankfully the Japanese imports are still around and they fare a lot better. We've got some cool shooters. 1945 1 and 2 get brought together for release, which is certainly good news for any fans of these perfectly good Psycho shooters. Play It also released the rock-solid Castle Shikigami 2 over here. It may not be the best looking shooter ever, but it's certainly fun to play and with some quite interesting close range mechanics. Wow, that really makes it sound appealing. Quite interesting close range mechanics. Anyway, it's good. Partnering up with Takara continues to bear fruit. From them we get Seek and Destroy, which is a pretty cool tank action game. Lots of arena fighting, careful turret moving and frantic trajectory calculations. But we also, much more interestingly, get the utterly curious, in some ways shoddy and in other ways utterly genius, Road Trip Adventure. How to describe this game? Well, it's kind of like a racing RPG. You do race a lot, but you also drive around the world, level up your car with new parts and chat to other cars. The races themselves can also take place in some quite weird locales. It's somewhere between arcade racing and kart racing. Now, don't get me wrong, Burnout Paradise this is not. You may well hate this game, but I find it quite a lot of fun and there's not much like it at all, certainly not in the PS2 days. It's weird, but pretty bloody good. Having said all that, there is no surprise as to what Play It's best Japanese PS2 import is. They managed to bring the superb Gungrave Overdose to Europe, which is the sort of game that plenty more people will like. There's a lot of plot around all the action and it's all a bit anime, but in the main, you control a reanimated dead dude who likes to shoot everything with guns, while also dealing with enemies at close range by swinging around his own frickin' coffin. All while the soundtrack of piano-forward smooth jazz plays. It's absolutely as mad as it sounds, and the action? Hell yeah. If you like a good rock, then you'll be wanting to play this one immediately. Why no one decided to give Gungrave another round in the 360 era is beyond me. Imagine if, say, Platinum had picked it up. Hell, why isn't anyone trying to do it now? I for one want a lot more casket-swinging, gun-toting action in my life, and this'll do quite nicely. Lastly, here's some of the definitely cooler games that Play It took a bit more of a hand in. If you're a retro lover, then you surely know Intellivision Lives. They're actually pretty good compilation of various Intellivision classics. At the very least, you know it for the legendary theme song. How could you put me in this position? I really miss my Intellivision. I mean, the game's worth booting up just for that, but I will happily go to it for a couple of rounds of my own personal favourites. Thin Ice, where a cute penguin does a jolly little jig whenever he cuts the ice up and murders one of his enemies, or Snafu, which is sort of like a competitive snake. Actually, for the younger generation, I would say it's exactly like Sliver.io, only nearly 40 years old. We also have the interesting and quite good Groove Rider. It's a kart racing game of sorts with all the power-ups and so on, but somewhat differently it's a kart racing game that's actually based on Scalextric. You have to skip between several fixed rails, being careful to get on the right one on sharp turns so you don't go flying off, and dealing with whatever demented layout some young child has made up for you. It's actually a cute little concept for a competitive racing game. Again, I've not seen much like this before. But another game that lands firmly in the very good pile, that's again not one too many people know, is Play It's Cell Damage. Now I suppose some would consider this to be a little derivative. It's a car combat game, very much in the Twisted Metal mould, only the graphics are thoroughly garish and cartoony. Indeed, as the name might suggest, they're cel shaded. I have a lot of time for it personally. There's a whole bunch of different modes, with the more regular Smack mode being my own favourite, and the tracks and weapons are all quite fun to use. It's quite enjoyable, and I definitely recommend it. And with that, well, I think we've covered most of Play It's output on the PS2. There's a lot of games and I'm sure I'm missing a couple here and there, but you can certainly see just how prolific they were. And there are still a few titles left to cover in the last chapter before we finally bring System 3 to the present day and bring this video to a climax. So we are starting to head close to modern times. As the PS2 era comes to an end and the company gets close to 30 years in the biz, System 3 decides to drop the Play It's moniker and go back to their original branding. And they also release a couple of games that are pretty close to Mark Cale's heart. Like seemingly everybody who becomes a success in the world of gaming, Mark Cale has a passion for fast sports cars. In particular, he likes Ferraris. Having previously done a little NES title with the Ferrari moniker on it, System 3 now get the Prancing Horses licenses for some more major games on the PlayStation 3, Ferrari Challenge Trofeo Pirelli and Ferrari The Race Experience. These games are essentially all about amassing a big old collection of Ferraris. There's about 50 of the motors in the game, from classic models all the way up to the ultra-modern FXX. Naturally you'll be racing these cars on various classic tracks. There's Monza, Silverstone, Spa, the Nürburgring, all the favourites in other words. And the more races you win, obviously the more money you get to fill up your garage with these ultra expensive Italian jalopies. If you love Ferrari then, well, you've come to the right place. You can't really question System 3 and Mark Cale's love for them. As for the game, well, it's a pretty hardcore racing simulator, and I'm absolutely dreadful at this sort of game. I mean, I think you can see it for yourself. My whole experience with the first game, Ferrari Tour Trofeo Pirelli, was mainly spent with television's own Tiffany Dell shouting and mocking every single move I made. Such was my inability to control the vehicle. Never been so insulted in my life. So, you know what, I'm not the best person to review this. I prefer the PSN only Ferrari The Race Experience, mainly because it adds some more casual modes that allow people like me who are much more used to arcade races and don't really believe in using the brake button all that much to be a little bit more competitive. One general annoyance, mind, is that these games are the sort where you have to unlock absolutely bloody everything. Which, look, sometimes you just want a bloody race, and it'd be nice to have the choice of more than 2 tracks at the outset. Frickin' racing games. These are okay, although I don't think they gained much traction in a sim racing world filled with juggernauts. Your Gran Turismos, Forzas, Colin McRae's and all that lot. And well, pretty much finally, we return to something from the past. To celebrate 30 years in the business, System-3 decided to make their way back to Putty Squad. Not just to make an updated version of the game, but to write an old one. The actual release, for free mind you, of the Amiga version of Putty Squad after nearly 20 years of waiting certainly did generate more than a few press inches all about how they'd finally decided to go back and finish it after all this time. Now of course how much System-3 actually did to finish Amiga Putty Squad is debatable, seeing as by all accounts the game that most people reviewed in 1994 was virtually done and the decision was taken then to not release it because it wasn't commercially viable. If you've already played the SNES version of Putty Squad, then the Amiga version of this game isn't exactly going to offer much in the way of surprises. It's still the same perfectly good platformer. Is it one of the best Amiga platformers? I mean it's good. Better than something like Super Frog, not too far from the likes of Zool 2. I'm not entirely sure if the game's worth the 90 plus scores that most magazines doled out to it back then, but it's decent, and it's nice to actually see it in full after all this time. In the main though, the actual release of Putty Squad on the Amiga also served to promote a brand new Putty Squad game. Or at least a modern remake of the game that would be available on PSN, Xbox Live Arcade, and various other platforms. Hell, it even got a re-release on PS4 not too long back. It certainly seems as though System-3 judged there was enough curiosity about Putty Squad to do this remake. Which is quite funny, because I mean, if they'd just released the game on Amiga as they'd planned back in the day, there's basically no way on this earth we get a remake of something as generic as Putty Squad in 2013. But, well, here we are. Once again, Putty is in your hands, and he has to rescue his fellow malleable mates over several levels of platforming action. So, what's it like? I have to say it's quite an interesting title. This game did not exactly get a good reception. Indeed, I've seen some people absolutely eviscerate it, particularly here on YouTube. Go ask Kadikarus about this game. If there's not something conveniently around to kick then, well he'll probably just kick you instead. And even though I actually enjoy the game, I can absolutely see why. I mean, this is a game completely out of time. The remake of Putty Squad may look more modern, but it pays no attention to any advances in the world of platforming. Games like Super Meat Boy, V6 or whatever may as well not exist. This fully caters to all the much hated nowadays tenets of classic European platforming. Garish to the point where it's pretty hard to even see what's going on, having to collect everything, leaps of faith, the odd little stereotype here and there. It's glorious. You do not get a platform game that screams out hard Brexit more than this. So with all that said, I might not call it a good game as such. I would struggle to recommend it, as unless you're familiar and nostalgic about all these Euro platforming tropes, you're probably going to despise the thing. Even then, you may wonder why the hell anybody would miss the things Putty Squad brings to the table. But, I can't hate it. I find it amusing to have a modern looking platformer, or at least somewhat modern looking platformer, that proudly embraces such tradition and shuns everything else. In doing so, there's actually not much else on the market like it. And while this does largely feature the original Putty Squad levels with some new ones attached, I almost want there to be a Putty Squad 2, a full-on sequel, that still doesn't move in any way with the times. I like that there's still a place for this sort of thing in the 2020s now, actually. And well, that's about it. Putty Squad isn't System-3's final game or anything, but I do think it's a good one to finish on. Mind you, there are other questions that still haven't necessarily been wrapped up, such as, will we ever see a return of what is probably the company's most fabled IP? System-3, as they exist now, certainly haven't been shy of teasing it. By my count, there's at least 3 times that I can see where they've mentioned plans for a Last Ninja based Kickstarter, or they've put feelers out for private showings at big events, or so on. And each time, well, not much has come of it. One time they even said there'd be a Kickstarter starting later in the month. And of course there wasn't. Why is this? Perhaps there's been a couple of more modern attempts that haven't ended up getting off the ground? Or the work's just taking its sweet time? What with there being several teasers of The Last Ninja's return, some aren't as charitable as that. People have said that it's merely a way to keep System-3's name around that usually precedes the release of something else entirely, such as, for example, an HD remake of Constructor that didn't exactly go down well at all, unfortunately. Mark Cale certainly does like to promise big, and often. System-3 did get off the ground thanks to his big mouth after all, so that shouldn't be a surprise. Whatever the status of The Last Ninja is, System-3 certainly do have quite a legacy. They have been around for nearly 40 years after all, and in that time they've basically done almost everything. They've been right at the forefront of things, they've been close to the epicentre of some failed projects, they've published all games great and small, they've done full-on budget work, and in more modern days, they've lent a fair bit on their past glories. As much as it can be said that Mark Cale has a big mouth, it's clear that System-3 have never tried to get too big. They've always been aware of certain limitations and have preferred to remain a small and independent company, which is probably a big reason why the company is still actually around after all this time with the same guy still in charge. And there's a hell of a lot more you can say for some other bigger companies out there. And thanks to all that, well, there's a whole load of games we can still enjoy from their long history, and who knows, maybe games that we'll enjoy in the future too. Bye for now. Thanks so much for watching this documentary on System-3. Once again, I'd like to put in a special thank you to Ian Roberts, who did request this and made this awesome double set of videos possible. If you like this video, please do like it, please do have a look at my social media, particularly my Twitter, that's where I'm most active. And also, if you want things like ad-free content, exclusive posts and old wrestling documentaries and new ones in the future, have a look at my Patreon. You could join this list of awesome people here. Alexa Jones-Gonzalez, Andrew Dalton, Andy Cat, Arcade Eloy Webmaster, Asobi Kwan DX, Brian Henniger, Chris Conrad Pritchard, D. Zalior, Rimwan Sutter, Dave Cork, David Rose, Dinty76538, Dustin Cooper, Gary Samaden, Geordie Alex, Glunfef, Ian Roberts, James Brown, Jason Stevens, Jace Alexander, Jeff Ladd, Matthias Gramzov, Martin Potaki, Potter Margel, Renbimon, Rusty Kelly, Seth Robinson, Simon Gulliver, Stuart Christopher Brownlee, Tariq Amir, Legeeky Dad, Tim Wald, Yerka Operator, and to all the rest of the awesome community, thank you so much, goodbye, and take care.